We ate in the dining room, where we last had a meal when Aunt Evelyn had brought Rabbi Bengelsdorf to meet us. After Alvin's call, my mother, whose inability to hold a personal grudge Alvin would have known he could count on the moment he heard her answer the phone, went off to buy food for dinner that would especially please him, and this despite the anxiety aroused in her each time she had to unlock the door and go back out on the street. That armed Newark cops were now walking the beat and cruising the local streets in squad cars gave her only slightly more assurance than did the glimpses of Bullet Applebaum's Jewish police, and so, like anyone else shopping in a city under siege, she wound up all but running back and forth to Chancellor Avenue to pick up everything she needed. In the kitchen, she proceeded to bake the chocolate layer cake with chocolate icing and chopped walnuts that had been Alvin's favorite, and to peel the potatoes and chop the onions for the latkes that Alvin could devour by the batch. And the house still smelled of the baking and frying and broiling that had been touched off by the unexpected homecoming when Alvin drove his new Buick into the alleyway. There, where we'd run pass plays together with the football I stole, Alvin pulled up behind the little Ford pickup that Mr. Kakuza used to move people's furniture as a second job, and that happened to be parked in the garage because it was the night watchman's day off. And on his day off, he slept round the clock. Alvin arrived wearing a pearl gray sharkskin suit, padded heavily at the shoulders, perforated two-tone wingtip shoes with taps on the toes and bearing gifts for all. Aunt Bess's was a white apron decorated with red roses, Sandy's a sketch pad, mine a Phillies cap, and Uncle Herman's a certificate entitling a family of 4 to a free lobster dinner at the Atlantic City restaurant. His giving us all presents reassured me that just because he'd run off to Philadelphia, he hadn't forgotten all the good stuff he'd found in our house in the years preceding his losing his leg. It certainly did not look then and there as though we were a divided family, or that when dinner was over, and Minna already in the kitchen taking a lesson in latke making from my mother, a royal battle could possibly break out between my father and Alvin. Perhaps if Alvin hadn't shown up in his flashy clothes and his snazzy car, all but seething with the raw carnality of Marsillo's gym, and exuberant with the imminent acquisition of undreamed-of wealth, perhaps if Winchell hadn't been assassinated 24 hours earlier, and the worst that had been feared when Lindbergh first took office hadn't seemed closer to befalling us than ever before, perhaps then the 2 grown men who mattered most to me throughout my childhood might never have come so close to murdering each other. Before that night, I'd had no idea my father was so well suited for wreaking havoc, or equipped to make that lightning-quick transformation from sanity to lunacy that is indispensable to enacting the unbridled urge to destroy. Unlike Uncle Monty, he preferred never to speak of the ordeal of a Jewish tenement kid on Runyon Street before World War I, when the Irish, armed with sticks and rocks and iron pipes, regularly came streaming up through the viaduct underpass of the ironbound section seeking vengeance against the Christ killers of the Jewish Third Ward, and much as he enjoyed taking Sandy and me to Laurel Garden on Springfield Avenue, when tickets to a good match came his way, men fighting each other outside a boxing ring appalled him. That he'd always had a muscular physique I knew from a snapshot taken when he was 18 and pasted by my mother into the family photo album, alongside the only other photograph surviving from his youth, a picture of him at the age of 6, standing next to Uncle Monty, 3 years older and close to 1.5 feet taller, 2 ragtag kids stiffly posing in their ancient overalls and their dirty shirts, with their caps pushed back just far enough to reveal the cruelty of their haircuts. In that sepia photo of him at 18, he's already 1,000,000 miles from childhood, a full-fledged force of nature, standing cross-armed in his bathing suit on the sunny beach at Spring Lake, New Jersey, the immovable keystone at the base of a human pyramid of 6 raffish hotel waiters enjoying their afternoon off. As evidenced in that 1919 photo, he'd been powerful through the chest right from the start, and the yoke-bearing shoulders and brawny arms he had somehow retained even through his years knocking on doors for metropolitan life, so that now at 41, after having worked hauling heavy crates and lifting 100-pound sacks 6 nights a week, all through September, there was probably more explosive strength stored up in that body than ever before in his life. Prior to that night, it would have been impossible for me to envision him beating somebody up, let alone battering bloody his beloved older brother's fatherless son. As to imagine him atop my mother, especially as there was no taboo stronger among Jews with our impoverished European origins and our tenaciously held American ambition than the pervasive unwritten prohibition against settling disputes by force. In that era, the common Jewish propensity was by and large nonviolent as well as non-alcoholic, a virtue whose shortcoming was the failure to educate the bulk of the young of my generation in the combative aggression that was the first law of other ethnic educations, and indisputably of great practical value when you couldn't negotiate your way out of violence or manage to run away. Among, say, the several hundred boys in my elementary school between the ages of 5 and 14 who were not chromosomally preordained to be top-flight lightweights like Ali Stoltz or successful racketeers like Longy's Willman, surely far fewer fistfights broke out than in any of the other neighborhood schools in industrial Newark, where the ethical obligations of a child were differently defined, and schoolmates demonstrated their belligerence by means not readily available to us. So then, for every reason imaginable, it was a devastating night. I didn't have the capacity in 1942 to begin to decipher all the awful implications, but just the sight of my father's and Alvin's blood was stunning enough. Blood spattered the length and breadth of our imitation Oriental rug, blood dripping from the splintered remains of our coffee table, blood smeared like a sign across my father's forehead, blood spurting from my cousin's nose, and the two of them not so much fist-fighting, not so much wrestling, as caroming with a terrible bony thwack colliding, rearing back, and charging in like men with antlers branching from their brows, fantastical cross-species creatures sprung from mythology into our living room and pulping each other's flesh with their massive snaggletooth horns. Inside a house, you usually scale down your movements, you scale down your speed, but here the scale of things was reversed and terrifying to behold. The South Boston riots, the Detroit riots, the Louisville assassination, the Cincinnati firebombing, the mayhem in St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Akron, Youngstown, Peoria, Scranton, and Syracuse. And now this, in an ordinary family living room, traditionally the staging area for the collective effort to hold the line against the intrusions of a hostile world. The anti-Semites were about to be abetted in their exhilarating solution to America's worst problem by our taking up the cudgels and hysterically destroying ourselves. The horror ended when Mr. Kakuza, in his nightshirt and his nightcap, attire I'd never seen before on anyone, man or boy, other than in a funny movie, crashing into our flat with his pistol drawn, a frantic wail rose from Joey's old-world grandmother, appropriately swathed like a Calabrian queen of the shades, at the foot of our landing, and from within our own flat came a noise equally hair-raising. The instant the splintered back door flew open, and my mother saw that the night-shirted intruder was armed, Minna began bringing up her hands. Everything she just swallowed it. Minna began bringing up into her hands everything she just swallowed at dinner. I couldn't help myself and promptly urinated, while Sandy, who alone among us was able to find the right words and the vocal strength to utter, cried, "Don't shoot, it's Alvin!" But Mr. Kakuza was a professional guardian of private property, trained to act now and draw distinctions later, and without pausing to ask who's Alvin, immobilized my father's assailant in a strangling half-Nelson with one arm while holding the pistol to his head with the hand of the other. Alvin's prosthesis had cracked in two. His stump was torn to shreds, and one of his wrists was broken. 3 of my father's front teeth were shattered. 2 ribs were fractured. A gash was opened along his right cheekbone, and had to be sutured almost twice as many stitches as were needed to close the wound inflicted on me by the orphanage horse. And his neck was so badly wrenched that he had to go around in a high steel collar for months afterward. The glass-topped coffee table with the dark mahogany frame that my mother had saved over the years to buy at BAM's, and where, at the conclusion of a pleasant hour of evening reading, she would set down with its ribboned bookmark in place, the new novel by Pearl Buck or Fanny Hurst or Edna Ferber, borrowed from the local pharmacy's tiny rental library, lay in fragments all across the room, and microscopic crumbs of glass were embedded in my father's hands. The rug, the walls, and the furniture were speckled with chocolate icing from the slices of layer cake they had been eating when they sat down over dessert to talk together in the living room, as well as with their blood. And then there was the smell of it, the airless, gag-inducing slaughterhouse smell. It was so heartbreaking, violence. It's so heartbreaking, violence, when it's in a house, like seeing the clothes in a tree after an explosion. You may be prepared to see death, but not the clothes in the tree. And all of it the result of my father's failing to understand that Alvin's nature was never really reformable, despite the lecturing and the hectoring love. All of it the result of having taken him in to save him from what it was simply in his nature to become. All of it the result of my father's looking Alvin over and remembering the tragically evanescent life of Alvin's late father. And, in his despair, sadly shaking his head and saying, "A Buick automobile, Sharpie suits, the scum of the earth for your friends. But do you care, does it bother you at all, Alvin, what's happening in this country tonight? It did years ago, damn it. I can remember clear as day when it did. But now, no. Now it's big cigars and motor cars. But do you have any idea at all what is happening to the Jews even while we sit here?" And Alvin, whose lot had finally come to something, whose prospects never before had been so hopeful, could not bear and would not endure being informed by the custodian whose tutelage had once meant everything, by the relative who, when no one else would have him, had twice taken him to live in a homey little Wequahic flat, amid a kindly family and their benign concerns, that he had come to nothing. His voice husky with the grievance of the injured party, he delivered staccato and without a single que sera to let anything in that wasn't retaliatory. All calumny, all castigation, all coercion, all fatuous bluff. Alvin shouted at my father, "The Jews! I wrecked my life for the Jews! I lost my fucking leg for the Jews! I lost my fucking leg for you! What did I give a shit either way about Lindbergh? But you send me to go fucking fight him, and the stupid fucking kid I am, I go, and look, Uncle fucking disaster, I have no fucking leg!" Here he hiked up a handful of the pearl gray fabric in which he so lustrously clad to reveal where he had indeed no longer a lower limb of flesh and blood and muscle and bone, and then, insulted, negated, inwardly once again, the unmanned man and the bum kid, he added in his final heroic touch, by spitting into my father's face. A family, my father liked to say, is both peace and war, but this was family war, as I could never have imagined it. Spitting into my father's face, the way he'd spit into the face of that dead German soldier. If only he had been allowed to go along unrehabilitated on his own stinking trajectory, but that hadn't happened, and so this was how the great menace undid us, and the abomination of violence entered our house, and I saw how bitterness blinds a man and the defilement it spawns. And why? Why did he go to fight in the first place? Why did he fight and why did he fall? Because there was a war going on, he chose that way. The ragtag rebellious instinct historically trapped. If only the times were different. If only he had been smarter. But he wants to fight. He's like the very fathers he wants to be rid of. That's the tyranny of the problem. Trying to be faithful to what he's trying to be rid of. Trying to be faithful to get rid of what he's faithful to at the same time. And that's why he went to fight in the first place. As best as I can figure it out. And we'll pause there.